I think it's both sharing people's stories, but also the confidence that stories can change us, right? That hearing someone's story and witnessing someone's story is what allows for conversion. That's how we come to grow. That's how we change our minds. That's how we mature. And part of the role of the bishop is to listen to all of those stories and find some way of integrating them and remembering them and weaving them together into this fabric of the whole.
Hi there, my name is Ariane Rice, and welcome to Feeling Beings Who Think. Now, if you are someone who does public speaking of any kind, whether as a leader or a preacher, then you know the power of story. When you step in front of a room or a church full of people, you don't start with facts and figures. Well, some people do, but let's be honest, they tend to lose their audience pretty quickly. One of the things you learn as you get more accustomed to public speaking, or at least one of the things I've learned, is that if you want to capture people's attention, then you start by capturing their hearts. And the best way to do that, tell a story. Today I'm speaking with Bishop Jennifer Reddall. She is the 6th bishop of the Episcopal Diocese of Arizona and the first woman to serve in that role. And I will let her tell you the story of how she got there. But she has long understood the power of storytelling. And in our conversation, she shares just how vital that is to how she sees her leadership. Because stories do convey so much more than just information. They connect us. They help us make meaning. They help us situate our story within a community, within a context. Stories allow us to see the deeper patterns in our lives, particularly when we take the time to reflect upon them. We all live within communities that shape and inform our stories. Sometimes those communities limit us, and we recognize we have to break free. And sometimes we find communities where we discover our deepest truths, opening ourselves up to new possibilities as we find the ways in which our story connects with others. In this conversation, Bishop Reddall shares generously from her story and the ways in which her role as being a weaver of stories allows her to most fully express her vocational call to serve. I'm so grateful to Bishop Reddall for sharing so generously and so joyfully, and for the ways in which we might take some inspiration for what it means to lead with the fullness of our humanity in a difficult time of change. I hope her words offer you some encouragement, insight, and maybe even a new way of seeing and learning more about who you are through your story. Thanks for being here. Thanks for listening. And now let's get to today's conversation. Welcome, Jennifer Reddall. Thank you for being here.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
Actually, I should say welcome, Bishop Jennifer Reddall.
Jesus knows me as Jennifer, so
okay.
It's okay.
That puts me at ease. It's funny. You and I were in seminary together. You and I have not crossed paths recently, where I have no idea. I think we're somewhere in a similar generational age, but there's this reality of you having a position and me having a position, and that simply creates this feeling that
yeah, we take our roles seriously in the Episcopal Church, and sometimes that gives greater intimacy, and sometimes it gives greater distance.
It sure does. Noticing. Anyway. Thank you for making time to be here today. We were just talking about, and I can't not say it because it's on my mind too, because we were just discussing it, that today is, I think, day 2 or 3 of the fires that have been ravaging California, and that's where you are from. And so even with that, would you mind just sharing with us and with me who you are in terms of how you work in the world and how you came to be there?
Sure. I think because I have LA on the brain, so I'm a beach girl from California. I grew up in Redondo Beach. I grew up in the Episcopal Church. So I grew up at St. Francis Episcopal Church in Palos Verdes. And my way of being in the church was through music. So my parents sang in the choir. And so I had to go to church early. And so when I was 6, I would go hang out with the junior choir, the kids' choir, while they rehearsed, while my parents were rehearsing. And there was eventually this big sort of shift where I would get permission to skip Sunday school so that I could sing with the junior choir during 1928 morning prayer.
Oh my gosh.
And then I would do 1928 morning prayer with my Sunday school class when they came back for their chapel service. So I often laugh that part of the reason I became clergy is that I skipped a lot of Sunday school, but I got a lot of worship. And I understood that I had a role in leading worship. And so church was never boring for me. It was always like, okay, I've got to sing this thing. I've got to get to the next page. And so I always just really enjoyed that. And then was very active in youth groups and happenings. We did happenings in LA. And my senior year in high school, I had been a staff member on a couple happenings before that. But in that spring, the girl who was chosen to be in charge of the happening the following summer was killed in a car crash.
Oh,
And they asked me to take her place. And in the process of taking her notes and working with the other teens and putting together this retreat weekend, definitely left that going. I really like creating this space where people can find God. I think I want to be a priest someday, but first I want to be a famous actor. So I went off to college and was a theater major. And then while I was doing that, I spent a summer at Shakespeare and Company up in the Berkshires and heard this amazing lecture on the origins of theater by Tina Packard. And she took theater back to doing ritual dance to make the sun rise. And everybody else walked out of that lecture saying, I want to worship at the theater. And I walked out of it saying, I have to be a priest.
you bring an interesting point. There are a number of us clergy who had some level of performing in a background before we felt a call or returned to an earlier feeling of the call.
Yeah, and at Shakespeare and Company, the director of training was a former Jesuit. So it's porous in both directions. And I think for me, it's that I loved to tell stories. And for me, I realized I wanted to tell the real stories, not that theater isn't real, but that I wanted to tell people's stories today rather than acting them out. But I was a storyteller then, storyteller now. And you're right, all that training of voice and body and presence. It's very useful in the church.
Well, I mean, I'm surprised you had little tasks, not little, but you had tasks to do as a small child in the church.
Mhm.
And the 1928 prayer book, for anybody listening who doesn't know, is you could probably look up boring in the dictionary. I think a 1928 prayer book might be next to it. You might take a different.
Oh, I'll push back on that. No, it's beautiful and archaic, right? Though, but my love of Shakespeare and my love of the 1928 prayer book are the same.
Okay. I should say, maybe not boring. I felt the one time I attended a church, I was in Blue Ridge, Georgia, just trying to find a place to go on a Sunday morning. Had never experienced that before. And I felt a very punitive feeling from the worship language that was used compared to what I was used to.
Yeah.
So,
I think that's there too. I don't spend my time using the 1928 prayer book
no.
but it gave me an appreciation for vocabulary and poetry that I am very grateful for.
Mm. I guess those are some of my New Yorker misconceptions about California as being a place that would have the most modern type of worship that would be happening.
That exists as well, but I was in a church that was founded in the 1950s by a priest who was still the rector when I was growing up in the 70s and the first half of the 80s. And he did not allow the quote new prayer book after it was published in 1979. So we didn't get that until he retired in 1985 or 1986 or something. And I did recently find my confirmation bulletin from 1986. And the confirmation in 1986 was using the hymnal 1982 and the 1928 prayer book. which for the Episcopalians listening to this will be laughing because that is a really weird combination. So they let us have the new hymnal, but they didn't let us have the new prayer book. And with that, for him, went all the gender norms. So women weren't allowed to read or be acolytes or do any of those things. There were women priests in the Episcopal Church and women. I was the first female person to read a biblical lesson at St. Francis in 1986.
Wow. And now you're the first woman bishop of Arizona.
Yeah, first from the time I was 11 until now.
That's exciting. And there's lots to talk about there. I just want to follow up a little bit on the storyteller. You said you wanted to tell people stories. So what did that mean for you? How did you envision that happening?
I think it's both sharing people's stories, but also the confidence that stories can change us, right? That hearing someone's story and witnessing someone's story is what allows for conversion. That's how we come to grow. That's how we change our minds. That's how we mature. And so cultivating the stories that we tell, what stories do we share? What stories do we not share? What stories do we highlight? What stories have been ignored and need to be told? We've been doing a lot of work in the last year in the Diocese of Arizona about doing listening and healing pilgrimages at sites of Native American boarding schools, because those are stories that I didn't learn growing up. And yet here we are in Arizona where there's 22 federally recognized tribes. And the people who had the stories often didn't tell them because to tell them was harmful. Um, and so now we're in a position where we can listen to the stories and not just listen to them, take action because of them to understand, what does reparation look like? What does justice look like? What does restoration of relationship look like after learning the stories that many of us were completely ignorant about?
I'm curious too, because I think for me, one of the calls and attractions in simply really returning to church as an adult was the idea that God knew my whole story. And I think God helps me acknowledge more of that story of who I am. And I'm curious for you, what was the story that maybe now you see that you were really grateful that God affirmed in you when you were at a younger age and maybe thinking about doing this or moving into this institution?
There's so many stories. I think the piece of how do we weave together our story and God's story, which is inextricably linked all the time, whether we're aware of it or not. But it was that I could see God's love for me. I could see the support through the faith community. I did have a supportive faith community, obviously. Lots of church trauma, lots of people have been harmed by the church. I was one where, for the most part, the faith community was supportive and affirming of me. And it was through the faith community and through the church and through my relationship with Jesus that I could see that I could be part of a bigger story, right? That I, Jenny Reddall, couldn't change the world. But I, Jenny Reddall, child of God, working with other children of God and empowered by the Holy Spirit, that constellation of work could actually make a difference. And I think that's true now. Someone asked at the consecration of a new bishop fairly recently, like, what advice do we have for the new bishop? And I said, what I learned in my first year was that part of the role of the bishop was that often we are the person who knows all the stories, right? And each clergy person has a story, each congregation has a story, each lay leader has a story. And part of the role of the bishop is to listen to all of those stories and find some way of integrating them and remembering them and weaving them together into this fabric of the whole. And so it's, I still see myself both as a storyteller, but also as a story weaver, that the repository of stories and connecting the people with the story over here and the story over there who don't know each other.
Right.
But who would love to. The first year I was here, I was installed at the cathedral on the day of the Phoenix Pride Parade. And so I didn't have a gig in the morning because I was being installed at an evensong. And so I discovered that there were a group of Episcopalians from the diocese who marched in the Pride Parade. It's great. I want to be there. And then there was a group of other Episcopalians from the cathedral who the Pride Parade organizers always had at the end of the parade to be counter protesters to the people who were protesting against the Pride Parade.
Uh-huh.
And they didn't know that they had never gotten together, these two groups. And so I was like, oh, we should get together and have Eucharist on the street before we each go to our separate places and participate in the Pride Parade in our different ways. So that's a really concrete example of I hear one story over here, I hear another story over here, and I can pull them together at the altar so that everyone knows one another
Yeah, and I
and
mean,
is one body.
and it's also an amazing, this is like the thing that you don't get to do outside a place like the church. You pull
Mhm.
people together not to have conversation in any way, but simply to engage in this embodied practice and then
Mhm.
go their separate ways. And it's
And
incredible.
you go do your ministry, we're going to do our ministry, and I'll see you at the end of the parade.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm thinking in my head about how you are the first woman bishop in Arizona, and you've been a bishop for how many years?
It'll be 6 years in 2 months. So
And you're going to have a nice long tenure ahead of you
I
because
hope so. I don't think I'll still be the Episcopal bishop when I have to retire at 72, because that would be a really long time. But I don't know. It's still fun and fulfilling ministry. And I hope so long as it is fulfilling and life-giving for me, I think that means it's likely fulfilling and life-giving to the diocese. There's a good long while to go.
you have energy even when you say it, and you radiate joy about it.
Yeah.
Clearly, that's
Yeah.
beautiful to see. Maybe you could just explain a little bit for somebody who has zero
Mhm.
idea about what a bishop could do in a church like the Episcopal Church. What's your job? What do you do?
Everything. It's like being a rector, right? So being a bishop, there is the best part of being a bishop is that every Sunday I get to be with a different congregation in the diocese. So we have 63 worshiping communities in Arizona, and that's everything from college chaplaincies to small rural churches to Spanish-speaking urban churches to big suburban churches. I just met with the rector of our South Sudanese congregation this morning because I'm visiting them in a week and a half. This Sunday I'll be in Douglas, which is an old mining town right on the border with Mexico, and it's a bilingual, bicultural, very small congregation who is fiercely holding on to being the Episcopal Church in Douglas because a year and a half ago, their church was burned down in a hate crime by somebody who did not like women in leadership and did not like LGBTQ leadership. And so I'll be with them. And so it's just every Sunday is something different. And I think the best experience I had of that was that there was one year where I installed a rector on a Wednesday night, and it was at a church up here in St. John the Baptist in Glendale. And he loves wearing Hawaiian shirts. And so the whole congregation wore Hawaiian shirts in his honor. The music was all sort of Cursillo folk music, guitars, praise choruses. It was great. And then the next day was Ascension Day, and I was down at St. Michael and All Angels in Tucson, which is our high church congregation, with everything was chanted. There was lots of genuflecting, there was incense, and they're both full expressions of the Episcopal Church.
Mhm. And at the
um,
same time, you don't spend all your time in a worshiping situation or at an altar.
but I don't have to pick. I get to do everything. And then during the week, it's a lot of meeting with people. My calendar is often just meeting. So it's meeting with people who are aspiring for ministry. It's meeting with congregational leaders who either are happy about something that's going on and want to bring the diocese in with it, or people who are unhappy with something that's going on and need help with figuring out how to proceed. Um, Part of it is vision casting. It's being the voice in the public square to some of the other judicatory heads, and I just put together a letter about immigration, which is obviously a very live topic here in Arizona, because one of the vows I took was to speak up for those who have lost their voice or don't have other helpers. And then also part of the time it's being the grown up in the room.
Say more, please.
So being a bishop is being often the person who has to say, stop it, or don't, or you did what? You shouldn't do that. and and that's, I sometimes laugh. Somebody asked me the first year, what did you say the most often? And I laughed and said, really? I was like, wait, never occurred to me. I've had to say things like, you can't have the finance committee meeting in a casino, which
No, no,
wasn't
no.
something I had ever really thought through, but that seemed pretty evident to me. And so it's some of that level of trying to keep the church healthy.
Yeah.
Um, and that's something that is not obviously the fun part of being a bishop, but it's an important part. And so I get to do.
What does health mean for you in the system
Um,
of church?
I guess where I would say, so church health for me means systems that can handle a certain amount of conflict, but are not always conflicted. But it means congregations that are loving to one another and loving to their neighbors. It means congregations that know why they exist. They have a relationship with Jesus, both as individuals and as a body, and can see their mission in the world. Like those are the vital, healthy congregations.
I would love, no pun intended, to spend a little time around the word love and the ways in which love has been experienced, maybe even in our own lives, as not necessarily some sort of feeling, right? That's
Yeah.
romantic or something towards somebody else, but is something hard, challenging, has to do with being seen for who we are. I'm just curious if there are stories for you. I think that's love your neighbor as love yourself, being loving, being kind. Like this is like a widely held secular religious belief or just general belief that we're supposed to treat each other kindly at best, just nicely as boringly worse.
Mm-hmm.
But that's not at all, I think, nor do I think you think loving neighbor as self is about. So I'm curious if there's a story for you, maybe even in your own life around that.
There is, but I would say I've spent more time reflecting on the difference between love your neighbor as yourself. So that's part of the great commandment. Love God, love your neighbor. With the commandment in John of love one another as I have loved you. If I love you the way I love myself, I'm going to love you in an imperfect way, right? Because I love myself very imperfectly. I sometimes love myself in ways that make myself seem a lot better than I actually am. And sometimes I love myself in ways that make me not nearly as good as I actually am.
Mm.
Whereas loving one another the way that Jesus loves us would mean to love one another perfectly. And so I think it's a much higher bar. And I think the real love is the Jesus love, is the agape love that's self-sacrificing and offering, and not just the sort of love that we have even for ourselves, which can be so misguided.
Yes. And so I just want to make sure I'm understanding because Jesus also wasn't always nice. He was very real with people, sometimes confrontational, sometimes dismissive, sometimes saying, no, you can't come. I'd rather you go do something else or you're not ready. So how does that play out in your?
Well, it's also, but it's also a love that's forgiving. So yeah, so I think Jesus's love has the accountability and boundaries that we want in love. That loving someone is not giving them permission to walk all over you.
Yeah, yeah.
Loving someone is, so I'm somebody who experienced divorce, and when I and my husband at the time were getting divorced, he's also clergy, and we did keep asking ourselves, what is the loving thing to do in this
Hmm.
situation? And that was part of the things that we intentionally tried to do when we were getting divorced, was to treat one another lovingly, even when we were mad at each other, even when we realized that our marriage was unraveling, but we still had a choice about how to treat one another. And we still had a choice about, we had a small child at the time. What was the loving thing for our child? And so that guided us in ways that I think has been very positive in the midst of a situation that is fraught with pain and grief and trauma and sin and all of those things. But there was still a sense of being able to choose the loving path as much as possible.
So that's one of those, and I find unique situations when real marriages in particular are ending. Not everybody knew that about what you were going through. So I'm just wondering how you navigated that at the time in your work. And maybe you could say a little bit about where you were working and how you went through that process.
Yeah, when Jonathan and I got divorced, I was the priest in charge at the Church of the Epiphany in New York City. And we were having our challenges, obviously, privately, and I didn't share it with anyone at the church until there was a Sunday morning where we had this older retired priest who was there, and it was at coffee hour between the services. There were only a few people there, and he asked me, he said, "What are you doing for vacation this summer?" And I just burst out crying because I realized I didn't know what I was doing for vacation that summer, because I didn't know if I was going to be married or not. And I just, blah, it all fell out. And he was so good and compassionate to me. And that helped to know that there could be a loving response to that. Because from my perspective, I did not want to be divorced. I did not want to fail at my marriage. I did not want to fail at like the most important thing and most important relationship in my life. I get a lot of, I like being good at things. I wanted to be good at being married. And the idea that it was all going to kind of spin out of control. And I guess I wasn't sure that I would be lovable if my marriage did fall apart. Would I be worthy of love if I did fail in this really spectacular way with all the effects it would have on me, on my child, my family? And like what I discovered through getting divorced, that actually I was still worthy of love. that having that type of incredibly vulnerable and public failure opened me up in ways that I had not anticipated and allowed me, when I did rely upon the love of friends and others to help get me through it, discovered, oh, I can get through it. And in fact, there is still joy in life. And in fact, there's even more joy in life than I had realized. So it was really hard, but it was also ultimately the brokenness was better than the holding it together in a way that was false.
What are some of the questions that women clergy or maybe not clergy bring to you when they're struggling with this?
Yeah, I think I've had a number of women clergy ask me about this because they're like, you got divorced. How did you do it? I think I have fairly sage advice about things like how do you share and who do you share with and when do you share it? And that's probably true for women and men because it's really hard to walk stuff back.
Mm.
And so by the time you make some sort of public statement of, hey, we're separating or something, like it's that train has left the station.
Right.
I was incredibly fortunate that because Jonathan was known to our congregation and because we did keep asking ourselves these questions about what is the loving thing to do, that meant that we sent a joint letter to to my congregation saying, we're separating, please pray for us, please respect our privacy. And I had a really good, healthy congregation who did those things. But we were able to share enough that we were like, okay, give us our space, but keep us in your prayers. Like, I really want your prayers. I really don't want your advice.
Big difference.
Yeah. And they were able to abide by that. And it was very helpful. But also we approached the divorce process not as, it is an incredibly ridiculous process to get divorced in this country. And we agreed on everything. Like we were not fighting on it over anything. We agreed on custody, we agreed on money, and it was still like 12 months of having to pay attorneys and things to do something that we agreed on. And my experience of other couples is that they don't generally agree on everything the way that we agreed on. That we were in an incredible position of privilege where we both worked and we both didn't want to hurt the other person and we both wanted to put the needs of our child ahead of everything. And that I had an incredibly privileged experience of divorce because of that.
I want to shift a little bit around. First of all, I'm curious, do you feel that as a woman clergy leader, that came up more when you were in your bishop process than it would necessarily for a male clergy person?
I don't think so. I think in my process, it was more that I wasn't currently married. Everybody else had their spouse with them in the bishop search process. I brought my mom because my parents live in Arizona. And so I was like, all right, everybody else has somebody with them to reflect and to say, like, how did that go? What did you hear? What did you see? And I wasn't going to have that. So I asked my mom to come. But yeah, I don't think that, certainly in Arizona, and I'm sure that could be different in some dioceses, people here live in the real world, right? Like people get divorced in 2025 United States. And so the fact of divorce wasn't a reason for, I think, getting rid of me, especially because I was willing to try to hide it. And it informs who I am in my faith, but it also gives me a great sense that my family life doesn't look the way that I necessarily expected it to or wanted it to, but I have absolutely found the holy in it. And, that comes through, right? So
women leaders and women leadership and how anecdotally from the outside, it seems to me that
more women are being elected into this position more frequently. If anything, you precipitated a wave of female leadership at the level of episcopate.
Yeah, I was right. I wasn't the first little wave. I was like right in the second wave. The elections, I think, of women to the episcopate really hit the ground in 2017. And I was elected towards the end of 2018. So my class of bishops, which is the bishops who were elected in 2018, is the first class of bishops that was half women and half men. So there were 10 of us, and 5 of us were women, 5 were men. And the class after mine, the class of people elected in 2019, I think is mostly women. So that was the first class that had a majority of women in it. So it's shifted things remarkably. And my first House of Bishops meeting, I think it was like the first time there was a line for the women's room. And so there was all this like celebration of women, and I was just like new and like wide-eyed, and everyone's like dancing in line in the ladies' room. And I'm like, what is going on here? And they're just like, no, there's never been a line before. This is amazing. And that I think I think it is changing the House of Bishops to have, I think there's about a third of us now that are women, but a third isn't half. But it's good, and it's good to have colleagues. Barbara Harris, the first woman bishop, was at the first House of Bishops meeting I attended because it was the 30th anniversary of her consecration. And it was so exciting. She just looked at all of us and was like, I never could have imagined. For all of those years, she was the only or one of 2 or one of 3. And for us, it was, and I will say that my first House of Bishops meeting, it was the bishops sit at round tables and we're assigned to these tables for 3 years so that you have a kind of like a colleague group that you are with at every House of Bishops meeting. And so in 2019, they assigned us to tables, and at any table that had 1 woman bishop, they made sure to have 2. So no woman was at a table by herself. You always had a buddy. And that was really great. So it wasn't an experience for me of feeling like you were always on display as like, look, it's the woman bishop. It was like, it was me and Carly Hughes who were at the table together. So we could, hey.
What do you think when I work with women outside the church in leadership roles who sometimes, if they're either moving into towards a position or they're in a position that was at one time occupied by a male leader, they express this idea that I'm not like that. That's not how I do leadership. And one of the things we talk about is all the different ways leadership can look and feel and be. What are some of the ways or differences or noticings for you that's distinct between matriarchal, patriarchal leadership?
I would say I think any leader can lead in any way they want and should not be bound by their gender norms, right? So I think there are male leaders who are pastoral and caring, who fit maybe more traditional female gender norms, and vice versa. So I wouldn't want to say that. I would say in my specific type of leadership, I think things that I bring to this role are some of the clarity of the stop it, the don't, quit it, some of that stuff. And maybe that's parenting, whatever it is. But I took a vow to uphold the doctrine, discipline, and worship of the Episcopal Church. And what you're doing is outside of that. So let's bring it in or figure out a different way forward. So some of that and the boundary setting, I think, are things that I hear a lot of female bishops doing.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of that stuff. But I think there's also, I'm a joyful leader, as you have gathered from this conversation. And I think that's something that the congregations in our diocese that are growing are congregations that are joyful often, right? They know how to celebrate, they know how to rejoice, and which doesn't mean that they are happy all the time. It just means that there is that sense of joy. And so for me, part of leadership is bringing joy everywhere I go and affirming the ministry that's going on, that the church in a rural community does not need to look like or aspire to be like some big suburban church. Like what you're doing is good. And so it's a lot of that where you're like, don't judge yourself by that. Judge yourselves by, are you serving the people you're in your community? Great. So.
It must be a real source of gratitude to be in a role where you offer people, I see you, and I want to celebrate you and acknowledge you, and that's not you as Jennifer, but you as the bishop. And
yeah, your bishop is proud of you. That carries a lot of weight.
Sure does.
And that That is joyful. And also it's what do we do when it is that we're gathering for a clergy retreat or for diocesan convention or for any of the reasons that dioceses get together? What does that look like, and what is it that we're wanting to do? We definitely want to get the business of the church done at a convention or something like that. But also, what are the spiritual things that we want people to experience? What do we want people to learn? How do we want their understanding of their discipleship and following Jesus to be grown or changed or affirmed in some way? So
maybe a way to bring us towards a close is around what are the spiritual gifts an institutional faith brings into the world for people who aren't of that faith or denomination?
yeah. So I'm an institutionalist, right? I'm a bishop. So I think institutions have value. And the fact that many institutions, including our own, including the church, sometimes fail and show themselves unworthy of blind trust. And people shouldn't have blind trust in institutions. But what institutions provide is the chance to be a bigger movement, a wider voice, more effective change. I would point to the letter that my judicatory colleagues and I just wrote about immigration, right? So that got more attention because it was from not all, but it was from the Roman Catholic disciples, ELCA, UCC, Presbyterian, Methodist, a large group of us. And that was able to get more attention than any one of us saying something did, because obviously it's something that we're really concerned about. And so that sort of working together makes a lot more sense to me than individual action, because one person can change the world, hear me, but also it's easier to change the world if instead of one person doing something, you have 100 or 1,000 or 100,000 people doing something. And so institutions and the church provide some of that, but it also provides on my own, I can go all sorts of places mentally, spiritually, emotionally that are not real. A community is what calls you back to reality. The community makes you accountable for your actions, for your beliefs. It confronts you with information that's different from what you believe. And I think that's important. But Arizona, obviously, politically is a purple state. There are people in my congregations who have voted for every person who ran for elected office in the last election, and we all get to live together. And there is something really challenging about that. And there's something really important and beautiful about that. The church is a space where you can sit next to someone who has a different political belief system and sometimes a different belief system in a lot of ways. But we can sit next to one another. We can treat one another with respect. We can worship together. We can go receive communion together. We can confess together. We can receive absolution together. And we can do all those things. And that doesn't happen in a lot of places in the world today. So I'm grateful.
From what statistics say.
So there's something to being part of a body that is diverse enough that you do get to experience something different than your own identity.
I think I want to close just by asking, is there anything you want to direct people's attention towards, where they can connect with you, find out more about you, or something you want to highlight that's happening in your diocese? And I also just want to know, like, personally for you, what's bringing you a lot of joy these days?
Okay, so we do have a really great weekly e-blast that I write a reflection for each week. So if people want
some of them, they were great.
Yeah, so if people want to go to azdiocese.org, you can sign up for the epistle, and you can hear from me every week, or just about every week, and find out everything that's going on here. So what do I want to draw attention to? I think this week I do definitely have on my heart St. Stephen's Douglas. And that's the church on the border that the arsonist burned down, a church that has served that community for over 100 years. And he also burned down the Presbyterian church next door. I'll be there on Sunday. The arsonist was convicted last fall. I went to the trial, and he was sentenced just on Tuesday. So he was sentenced to 36 and a half years and expressed clearly that he has no regrets and would do it again. And so I would ask for people to go look up St. Stephen's Douglas and what they're doing, because they're fighting hard and they're growing, and we're working at rebuilding, because I don't want someone out of hate to prevent us from ministering in Douglas, right? I don't want to abandon rural communities. And so it's really important to me that St. Stephen's Douglas gets rebuilt so it can continue to live into that identity. And if people are curious about that, they can come learn about the ministry of St. Stephen's. So
awesome. Thank you. I think that's great. And thank you again for making time with me. And it's really great to talk with a leader and just to talk with a person who clearly loves what they do. Like you love what you do, and that comes across. So Thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.